I joined the Brown Advisory Student Managed Investment Fund, which manages a portfolio of more than $700,000. As part of this class, we research companies that we might like to invest in, and we've done pretty well, beating the market with an annual return of 5.48% for the last 12 months. As part of this extracurricular course, which is under the direction of Professor Huju Tsai and Washington College parent Richard Bookbinder, the fund's analysts were invited to submit an investment research project and essay as a way to compete for the opportunity to attend the 51st annual shareholder meeting for Berkshire Hathaway this past April. 4 of us would have the honor of taking part in the Woodstock for Capitalists, and I was one of the lucky ones. I returned from the trip a changed investor and a changed student. One great experience leads to another here. This past summer, I had the privilege of interning with Corbin Perception, an investor relations consulting and advisory firm in Connecticut, launched by Rebecca Corbin-Lurie, a Washington College alumna now serving on the Board of Visitors and Governors. On the job, I used everything that Washington College has taught me: how to work with numbers, how to conduct research, and how to interact and communicate with people. Thank you, WC. Through the George Washington Leadership Series, our college community hears firsthand how industry leaders bring creativity and innovation to the workplace, how they turn challenges into opportunities, and how they perceive and react to trends in the industry. This truly is one of the most compelling advantages that Washington College students enjoy. And today was no exception, as students studying communications, finance, economics, and business spent more than an hour with today's guests discussing the future of America's national debt and the burden it will play on the economic futures of young people. In a round-robin style of conversation, we debated the pros and cons of current and former monetary policy and the effect that fiscal policy can have on corporate profits. I now have the privilege to introduce our exceptional guests, Rick Santelli, Sheila Bair, Jeffrey Lacker, and Brian Rogers. Rick Santelli Rick Santelli is an editor for CNBC Business News Network. His focus is primarily on interest rates, foreign exchange, and the Federal Reserve. Mr. Santelli hosts the Santelli Exchange from the trading floor in Chicago and is also a regular contributor to CNBC's show Squawk on the Street, which offers live coverage from the New York Stock Exchange. Our illustrious college president, Sheila Bair, is the former chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. President Bair led the federal agency for a 5-year term during one of the nation's most challenging economic periods. One of the first officials to warn about the oncoming subprime mortgage debacle, she worked relentlessly to represent the interests of homeowners, bank customers, and taxpayers as the crisis played out, prompting Time magazine to label her the little guy's protector-in-chief. Jeffrey Lacker is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and serves on the Federal Open Market Committee, which conducts monetary policy for the Fed. He has had his finger on the pulse of the national economy and has continued to push for moderate increases in interest rates as a preemptive move to keep inflation under control and to prevent aggressive rate hikes that could potentially cause another recession. Mr. Lacker, who holds a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin, has taught at the College of William and Mary and at the Cranner School of Management at Purdue University. He serves on the board of the University of Richmond and on the board of directors for the Council of Economic Education. Chairman of the board and chief investment officer of T. Rowe Price, Brian Rogers serves on the Equity, Fixed Income, and International Steering Committee, in addition to the Asset Allocation Committee. He has spent 33 years with T. Rowe Price and is formerly the manager of the U.S. Large Cap Value Strategy and the Income Equity Strategy. Mr. Rogers, a trustee of Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medicine, is also a member of the Maryland Economic Development Commission. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the event. Mr. Santelli, the floor is yours.
I want to get to everything rather quickly, but I do have to say a great thank you to all the wonderful students I've met at Washington College. Just some of the older people in the crowd my age, I think our future's in good hands. There's some great talents and wonderful students. All right, I want to get this right. I'm not one person for teleprompters and notes, but our fiscal health, how national debt could impact the future for America's youth. I wanted to get that right, because that's key. And of course, we're going to start out with the first question to the president of Washington College, Sheila Bair. Sheila, every time I read that, it gives me a bit of pause. $20 trillion in debt. Many people look at the budget deficit and they say, well, you know, in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, the budget deficit was over $1 trillion. Last year was $450 billion, a mere bag of shells. These aren't good dynamics. It's always a positive to have every year's budget get closer and closer to zero. But all the years that aren't, we trail along like saddlebags on a mule. How is that going to impact the younger people in this crowd?
I think it's going to have a big impact, and we're on a very unsustainable trajectory. I think there's general agreement about that, and we should care about it. It's squeezing out discretionary spending already, spending on things like education, infrastructure, transportation, job training, the kinds of things that really build our economy for the future. Defense spending is under strain, and Medicare and Social Security, so-called entitlement programs, because of the changing demographics, are claiming an increasing proportion of the budget. That squeezes out everything else. Plus interest payments on this humongous debt we have. That is not huge right now. It's around 6%, but you know, with just a 1 percentage point increase in interest rate, and we're seeing some significant movement in interest rates already, that dynamic could change significantly. So we've gotten behind this already. We need to get ahead of it, especially I think on entitlement spending. Having some common sense reforms now, you can accumulate savings over a period of years before they finally run out of money. But if they don't, we don't do that, I worry about the hard choices, and my fear is because retirees are going to be such a larger part of the population, it's the younger people who will be in the workforce who are going to be having to pay higher payroll taxes to support this huge and growing elderly population. So I'm very worried about it, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to sponsor this conference, to try to highlight it. Unfortunately, it was not a big component of the presidential debates. We hope, now that we have a president-elect, we hope that maybe we can get a little more higher up on the agenda.
Jeff, when I look at the debt and I consider how deleveraging would be such a positive within the U.S. economy, since the election, and there were obvious surprises, we've seen a market response where, like the good old days, higher interest rates are going along with higher equity values, going along with a higher currency. That kind of trifecta, back in the day when I used to be in the pits, was considered a good thing. Okay? You don't want to have interest rates go up and the equity markets go down. You don't want to have a stagflation scenario. What do you think of the market response post-election with respect to markets and with respect to growth? Because embedded in this question is one easy observation. Throughout all the civilizations of the past, anytime debt becomes an issue, I always find that it's either corrosive to the point where it changes the future, or you have to have growth to displace debt. Is this a growth environment? Is this a good thing?
I think it's too soon to say, but I do think that it's plausible that market reaction reflects a sense, first, that a broader and deeper fiscal stimulus is on the horizon, that greater federal deficits are on the horizon. I think it's also plausible that they think inflation's more likely, and the inflation premia, break-even inflation rates have gone up. I also think it's plausible that they see more real growth opportunities on the horizon as well. Just how that mix plays out in reality, I think it's too soon for markets to know. They can't know for sure. And we'll see as policies come together and get enacted, and we see which direction the administration and Congress wants to go. But I think it's quite plausible that they see higher deficits ahead, and that's driving up interest rates. For me, as a monetary policy maker, I take that on board. We take on board everything we see in the economy that's going to affect the growth outlook. And, for me, the general principle applies that a more expansionary fiscal environment generally necessitates higher short-term real interest rates, higher policy rates, in other words. So for me, this seems, if what the markets are expecting by way of greater fiscal stimulus comes to pass, it's likely to mean more rapid rate increases for the FOMC.
Now, I want to get a little more personal on something. When I look at the Federal Reserve, I see an entity that tried to do its best to create positive outcomes at a time where, and it was said by many participants on the FOMC committee and the head, whether it was Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen, the chairperson, that Congress wasn't enacting enough fiscal stimulus, which is what you referred to, the markets anticipating things are going to happen. Why is it that Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke or why can't they craft in their statements every 6 weeks? Why can't they scold Congress in a much more direct way? Why can't they say, listen, we're not going to set a pick for you. We're going to let the ballot box toss you out if you don't do something to fix the economy. Or when it comes to issues such as entitlements, which were not a big issue in the election. Alan Greenspan, I remember his speeches in the 90s. This demographic time bomb, you could see it from a long distance. And the discretionary spending that we have, what's left for everybody else in some of our programs, is getting very small. Do you think the Federal Reserve ought to try to be more direct in trying to get more efficacy by other parts of the government?
It's a really good question, Rick. I can't speak to what Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen might have said in private to the administration or Congress, but I know that in testimony, in the semi-annual monetary policy report to Congress testimony, I know that they said pretty explicitly that if fiscal policy was more expansionary, our job would have been easier and would be easier, and we'd have a better time, easier time keeping inflation up and keeping growth up. So I know they articulate. They may have articulated it in the typically understated manner that central bankers typically express things. Now, there's a reason we're understated about things like that, and it has to do with our independence. Governments around the world have found it useful to delegate to an institution that's a bit insulated from the political, to and fro, the job of ensuring price stability, because whoever's in charge of monetary policy always has the temptation to do something that's beneficial in the short run and can help electoral chances in the short run, but incur costs in the longer run. So they insulate, they give it to an institution that's insulated from politics, but the other part of the bargain is we stay out of politics. So I think Fed chairmen have traditionally been very circumspect about saying whether it should be taxes or spending that should make the adjustment. We're not going to get into that. That's up to Congress and the administration. But maybe that diminished the forcefulness with which they expressed
it just seems that they were very forceful in increasing their balance sheet from $800 billion to over $5 trillion. They went from a nudging institution to basically sort of kind of running the markets. I get what you're saying, and there's been a lot of people before you, and there's been a lot of independence issues. But it certainly seems as though if they can be so bold as to take their charter to the gray, and I do think I'm paraphrasing Mr. Volcker right after the crisis when he said they're pushing their charter to the limits to be buying debt issued by another branch of government. When there's talk about, and they haven't done it, maybe buying corporates, maybe buying equities like the Bank of Japan does, it just seems to me, and I completely respect your answer, but it seems as though every 6-7 weeks when they have these meetings, they try to defend this aggressive action. But as you said, they just kind of want to tread softly on how the people responsible for this mission are so negligent. But we will leave it at that, because these are issues that are going to be important moving forward, and they will affect investments. And I think, Brian, this is kind of the area I would like to go with you, because it's all connected. So if Mr. Kuroda and Abe in Japan buy stock market, they own a portion of many companies. It seems like nothing is off limits. Mario Draghi, who is head of the European Central Bank, is buying corporate securities. Does this make you worry at night a bit, Brian, that ultimately central banks want more risk undertaken. They want everybody to spend. They keep rates low. They don't want saving. But yet now, everything's changed with this election. What happens to all these positions? Why would I want to buy a corporate security for a yield when I can buy something from the U.S. Treasury? And those yields are getting closer and closer.
I think Jeff Lacker would make a great portfolio manager. And if he chose to buy corporate bonds and stocks, I think that'd be great. You know,
I'd rather not.
you'd rather not know. Let me step back just a bit. One of the, I think, outstanding questions now as we talk about fiscal policy is how much more stimulative fiscal policy. Can you hear me now?
That's great.
Is it plugged in?
Can you hear me now?
Is it plugged into the?
Looks like it should work. How's that?
There we go.
There you go.
We're going to keep this right here. I'm not going to put this back in my ear. I think one of the outstanding questions is how much more fiscal policy, stimulative fiscal policy, can we stand with deficits in the $450 to $600 billion range 7 years into an economic recovery? One of the issues, I think, with respect to President-elect Trump's proposals is he would basically increase the rate of deficit spending by $6 trillion over the next decade. That would be, what, another $600 billion a year in deficit spending. So I think one of the issues is we have to get back to basics, and I almost want to go back and dust off a Simpson-Bowles report from 6-7 years ago and try to look at how to get things back in order so that spending grows at a slower rate than revenue production, and the deficit slowly contracts over time. I think one of the issues for students here today, back to the title of the session, is one thing that happens when there's too much debt overhang in the economy is growth is slower than it should be, job formation is slower than it should be, you'll have trouble getting jobs coming out of here with that giant debt overhang. So I think that's the long-term issue. We could talk about the student debt burden, that's a whole separate topic, Rick. But I think we're in a position where we have to go back and look at spending. We have to look at I'm not sure it makes sense to cut $6 trillion in taxes over the next decade. I'm not sure the U.S. economy can stand that from a deficit standpoint. So I think we're in a really difficult time. I think equity markets have had this 5-day or 4 or 5-day trading euphoria post-election. It remains to be seen how that will play out, but I think the honeymoon will be over fairly quickly when the rubber meets the road in terms of President-elect Trump's proposals that we will see early in 2017.
Excellent. See, Sheila, let's pick up right on that. So, if all the things that the market seems to be anticipating, lower taxes, less regulation, spending, even though the infrastructure spending is supposed to be funded from the private sector, I think that's going to be a bit of a stretch. So, if I was a student and I had student debt, or I'm a student coming into the program, how should I deal with these issues? What strategy should I have? Because I agree with Brian. There's no layups that the market has it right here, and there's no layups that the growing deficit and less tax revenue isn't going to create a situation that may create more pressure.
Well, and I think it's important to emphasize that fiscal stimulus does not have to be funded with deficits. I mean, I think there's lots of economic research that shows that lowering the top rate, broadening the base, has a stimulative impact. I mean, that's basically what we did in 1986 when I was working in the Senate under President Ronald Reagan. So I think there are smart ways to do this. Even infrastructure spending, you know, I think you can finance revenue-producing infrastructure projects. You can do public-private partnerships that requires put some better market discipline in by having private capital at risk as well. I think there are ways to construct infrastructure programs that are not budget additive, but provide some needed infrastructure repair and some good jobs in the process. So I guess that's first. I think we can be fiscally smart about stimulus, so I wouldn't want to rule out stimulus just because we think that's going to blow out deficits. I don't think it has to. And I think on the student debt issue, actually Donald Trump, I thought, had a very interesting speech that he gave in Columbus, Ohio in October, echoing, I think it was a very high-level description of his plans, but I think what he was talking about doing was shifting out of this debt model that we use now into what's called an income share model, so that higher education is financed not by debt, which is a fixed payment over a period of years with interest that you have to pay back, but what I would call an equity model where your obligation is basically paying back a percentage of your income, whatever you actually make, over some period of time. And again, I think you can construct that kind of shift, letting students out of debt into this income share arrangements in a way that will not be budget additive. Because basically what you do is you lower the payments up front, but you have a longer period of time over which they're paying back. So I do think there are very smart ways that we can provide relief to student debt, that we can stimulate the economy that will not add to budget deficits.
Jeff, the balance sheet has been actually a big positive for the U.S. Treasury, has it not?
The Fed's balance sheet.
Yes, quite a bit of money has rolled back into the Treasury coffers. If interest rates, of course, if interest rates go down, the price of the securities goes up, and the Federal Reserve owns a boatload of securities. As interest rates move higher, even as we talked earlier, maybe that's a good thing. It's kind of the growth model. How will those higher interest rates affect the Fed's balance sheet, especially relative to the fact that a lot of that money has already been taken away? There is no cushion anymore. Some of it actually went into the roads and it was redirected. Any thoughts?
So the mechanics of it are as follows. We have a large balance sheet. Maturity is several years on average. It's earning a reasonable rate of return, what you earn on treasuries. Our liabilities consist of the paper currency we hold, which pays zero interest, and reserves that the banking system holds with us. And we pay a small interest rate on that, and that interest rate is the interest rate that we move in order to control the general level of interest rates. That interest rate is 50 basis points now, and our portfolio earns substantially more than that. So right now we've been remitting a substantial amount to Treasury, $80 billion last year, for example. So as interest rates rise, a couple of things happen. First, our earnings are going to be higher, and if the yield curve steepens, then the gap gets bigger and we'll remit more to Treasury. On the flip side, however, there will be capital losses on the Treasury securities we hold. Now, at the present, we don't have plans to sell the securities, so we're not going to realize the securities, and our accounting system is book value, so we're not going to recognize the unrealized losses, but they will show up on our balance sheet in a footnote. Way off in the back of our financial statements, every quarter you'll be able to see unrealized losses or gains. And so that could potentially swamp our capital, which is, thanks to the wisdom of Congress, been reduced to about $40 billion. So we're in a situation where optically we could look strained. Although it wouldn't threaten our operations and our ability to conduct monetary policy, I think that's a worry for us. I think that's ought to be a worry for the country. I think we ought to run our central bank in a way that it maintains credibility. And I think having a healthy capital cushion is a part of that. And I very much regret what happened with the FAST Act last year. I think it was a mistake to cut into the Fed's capital to fund a highway trust fund.
Sheila, comment on Jeff's answer there, because obviously there's a dynamic there that you have an
Right.
opinion on.
Right. Well, no, I was just chuckling about the footnote disclosure, because what the government does and what we allow financial institutions and banks to do are so different things. So, yeah, I think this is a politically an optical issue that could hurt the Fed, and they're certainly aware of it. That's not exactly a news flash, but yes, they could appear as insolvent, and that could be, to the extent people like to beat up on the Fed anyway, that could give them more ammunition. But I think you're right. It doesn't impair. Hey, you can print your own money, so
Right.
it really doesn't impair the ability of the Fed to conduct monetary policy. But again, I think though I will say I think there's one positive for the Fed with the new president. I know that most of the commentary has been this is terrible for the Fed, but if he does fiscal stimulus in a smart way, I think it actually can counterbalance any negative impact the Fed may experience by raising interest rates. And so I do think, to the extent if we have smart fiscal stimulus to counter any adverse ramifications from getting out of accommodative monetary policy, it might actually be a good thing for the Fed and give them a little more flexibility.
Yeah, I agree. Some economists have commented that already. I'd point to Christopher Sims, a Princeton economist at the Jackson Hole Conference, delivered a really interesting paper at
Yes,
lunch.
I read it.
Yes, and pointed out the fairly deep level of monetary policy and fiscal policy are linked, and that the way fiscal policy is envisioned by the investors to react to monetary policy is a key thing. And that, I mean, we could be seeing just the sort of thing he might have advocated. I haven't talked to him about it lately, but you know, that could be aiding inflation expectations and making our job easier.
Right.
Brian, as we listen to this conversation, and the topic, of course, debt and how it affects students, many of these students are graduating or have graduated, and just because they owe student debt, and hopefully they're making their payments because they have a job, but there's also an investment issue. Just because you have debt doesn't mean as a young person embarking on your life and your career, you shouldn't have some investments for the future. What advice would you give young people at a time where the safe harbor, treasuries, is coming off what is deemed a generational low yield, which means they're really expensive in price. So if you buy those because you want to be conservative, you might be buying the top. Equity markets, also complex. Many think they've been running on fumes, but they have a new initiative after the election. What advice would T. Rowe Price and Brian give to a young person to start making their inroads and investing for their future?
Rick, can you hear me now? Perfect. Rick, my first move is to petition the SEC to adopt book value accounting for T. Rowe Price Group. So we don't have to mark any debt instruments to market. That's step number one. I think, so let me throw out a number, $54.61. That was my monthly student loan payment for 10 years after I graduated from college. And it was for a loan balance of $5,000. Rates were higher back then, late 70s. And it reflected a loan balance outstanding of roughly a third of my income at the time I graduated. I think what we've seen over the last decade or two, Rick, really, is people just borrow more and more money. It's not all Sheila's fault, but of course, HEPI, the Higher Education Price Index, goes up at a faster rate than the CPI every year. So you have to borrow more to stay in school than you used to back in our day, Rick. We were a year apart, I guess, back in the day. So you have to borrow intelligently. There's nothing wrong with debt. There's the concept of the optimal capital structure, which applies to companies, but it also really can apply to the individual. And I think you have to keep some of those basic principles in mind about the reasonableness of one's borrowing. I think in terms of investment advice, the easiest piece of advice I can give you is when you start working for someone, for whatever the organization is, you take the easy wins. So if a company matches a 401k contribution, you want to max out with that. If they have an employee stock purchase plan, you want to max out with that. Oftentimes companies match those kinds of things. If you're working for a public entity, you want to invest in a 403b or 457, whatever it might be, and start taking advantage early on of retirement savings. In terms of what to invest in, Rick, I think that's the $64,000 question today. Fixed income securities are relatively richly priced. A good portfolio of reasonably dividend yielding equities in good companies with good moats around their businesses, that's a fancy investment term for competitive barriers against entry, really would be the way to go. Companies might yield 2 to 4%, sell at not particularly high valuation levels, have great long-term operating histories, and you can dollar cost average into investments like those within the context of a tax-deferred retirement plan, whether or not it's a 401k plan or an IRA or Roth, whatever it might be.
Excellent.
Brief answer to a very complicated question.
Very good. Sheila, you're embarking on some very interesting ways to deal with the high cost of college education. It's almost as if many of the articles I've read say Washington College is an incubator for some of the ideas of the future. The problem with being an incubator is that others need to jump in, and we live at a time where there is real intransigence in the system to do new things. Times are tough.
That's true.
What would you say to other universities and colleges? How can they ease the burden on the dynamic of inflation in college costs, so outpacing annual inflation for so many years?
All right. Well, I think, we celebrate measured, sensible risk-taking here. We encourage it. I think colleges should. It's part of intellectual growth and development. And sometimes there's more risk in not doing something than there is in doing something. And I do think that colleges have reached the point now where the current path, the status quo, is unsustainable, much like our federal deficits and federal debt. The ever-escalating tuition increases are just not sustainable. Again, it's a lot about demographics, it's about our shrinking middle class. There are a lot of reasons why, even if we wanted to pursue it, and we certainly don't want to pursue it here, that it's just not sustainable. So yes, there'll be cost of living increases, and yes, it's, you can't freeze tuition forever, but being very smart about how you spend your money, being very smart about your scholarship programs, trying to direct more philanthropy to scholarships. I think some of these very large institutions with these multi-billion-dollar endowments that only draw 3.5% of their endowment, and then spend a very small percentage on scholarships. That is something that really needs to change.
Donald Trump, I think, actually has.
He did, he has. So yeah, on higher education, he's had some interesting ideas that I think could, in a different way, but still, because another way to tackle student debt is to make more scholarship funding available, so kids have a scholarship and not a loan to help pay for college. So I do think we're trying some innovative things. We're being very analytical about it. I think we're being smart about it. But again, I think there's more risk with inaction than there is with action.
Jeff, the Federal Reserve worries a lot about the dollar. That the higher dollar creates a raft of issues that the Federal Reserve needs to contend with. Sometimes emerging markets, some of the collateral damage to other economies. But in a very simple term, when I look at students, when I look at my mom or my relatives, a strong dollar means that Americans within the borders of our country have more purchasing power. As we normalize rates, meaning the Fed probably at some point is going to raise rates more, make them more normal, the dollar's probably going to get even stronger. What is the issue that you would like to embark on these students in terms of the foreign exchange aspects, considering everybody here when they get a job most likely is going to get paid in dollars?
We set monetary policy for domestic monetary conditions to keep inflation low and stable in the United States. The value of the dollar on foreign exchange markets is, as you know, a product of supply and demand in foreign markets. And here, it's a product of both demand for our exports, our demand for imports, capital flows from abroad to here. And we've been in a very attractive place to invest for a couple of decades now, a very attractive place. And that's been one thing keeping yields down here. So I think to focus on their domestic opportunities and the value here, if they want to travel, obviously the value of the dollar is going to affect that. Markets are going to take care of what the value of the dollar is going to be. And I think that makes sense. If I could just piggyback on the last two questions. Though.
Certainly.
Yeah, this is the thing. They did this in the debate all the time. They'd answer the previous question.
That's good, though. We like that.
Yeah. So all the students are here are making investments. They're investing in their own human capital. And so your question to Brian was really about what other investments they should be making. This is one of the three biggest decisions a person makes in their life. Their human capital, their saving for retirement, and home purchases. Three huge decisions. And I applaud all the students who've come to a fine college here, but they need to know, looking ahead, they're making an investment. It still pays off despite the rapid increase in college cost. It's still a very worthy investment. They should be realizing that, not only is it the skills that they learn, the things that they're going to, the equipment they're going to bring to the first job they have, but it's the ability to learn new things over time, because 10, 20, 30 years down the road, they're going to be in a job market that we can barely foresee at this point, and they need to be prepared to be agile, to respond to the shifting currents that the market throws at them, but to welcome those challenges, because it's an exciting world they're coming out into, but it's a great choice they made to invest. I'll also say, the investment pays off if you finish college.
Yes.
It turns out that if you, and a huge fraction of students, something like 40% nationwide, don't complete 4 years of college
contribute to the
within
student
5
debt
years.
numbers we quote.
That's right.
Exactly.
With the higher default rates. Yeah.
The premium, the premium in the labor market is just about 15% over those who've never attended any college at all. So it's not worth it to drop out. You need to complete college to get the bump in earnings. And it's something like 80-90% earnings bump you get.
It is. It's a very good investment, and it does make sense to borrow something, not to borrow excessively, but it does make a lot of sense to borrow something. It is a good investment, and you're right, a lot of the defaults are driven by students who drop out. And that's tragic because they have the student debt and they don't have the degree to give them that higher earnings potential.
And
So
it's
now
not
this gets to the
dischargeable in
next
bank.
And it's
question.
not dischargeable in bankruptcy. Yeah,
I
that's
like
right.
this loose format.
Yeah.
In your writings, you
Yes.
said that about 40% of the outstanding student loans are non-performing. Now, I understand that people who haven't finished might make that statistic a little less meaningful, but there's some gray here. I agree, Jeff, that an education is worth it, but many may spend too much and put themselves in too much debt for a job that may garner them an annualized income that would take them 15 years to pay off their debt. What do you think about that, Sheila? Are certain curriculums or certain colleges, if these students have siblings or brothers and sisters that are going to embark on an education, is there something they need to consider about their career path, their debt? Is there anything that can help them make the decision that we all know that you get a better job if you have an education, but against the debt versus income, not all occupations are created equal?
Yeah. No, that there does need to be an understanding of what your likely post-graduation earnings potential will be, and also your likely monthly payment based on whatever kind of debt trajectory you're on. We've actually been talking internally about trying to provide some kind of calculator so students can make that calculation more easily. So that absolutely needs to make it a smart investment. That absolutely needs to be part of the calculus, and colleges should be proactive in helping their students understand that. We want students to pursue the intellectual pursuits that are at their heart's desire. You spoke very eloquently earlier about students really pursuing what they like, but they also need to know where the job opportunities are, where particular majors you'll probably have to get a graduate degree to get a decent paying job. And so those are all kinds of information that we really need to make sure students are aware of through our Career Services Center, through our financial aid office, for our faculty advising, because it can be a smart investment if you do it in the right way. That 40% number, I should also say, just to get back to the earlier discussion about income share, that's the percentage of students who are the borrowers who are not paying according to the original contract terms. In other words, the straight 10-year amortized loan. And again, I think you can get that non-payment rate down according to the original terms much easier if you just shift everybody into some type of income share arrangement as opposed to this rigid 10-year amortization, which doesn't fit. You have widely varying income potentials from college graduates, and it's really just a more equitable and I think ultimately better for taxpayers to get everybody into an affordable payment that they can actually pay and just have them pay over a longer period of time.
Hey, Rick, there has to be a shared sense of responsibility, I think, between the individual, the student and his or her family, between the college or university and the financial aid office,
Yeah.
and including the lenders. And it almost reminds me a little bit of the financial crisis, where a lot of lenders would just lend anything to anybody on any terms. And so I think there's really a three-party sense of shared responsibility here that if people had behaved more diligently, the crisis might not be where it is today. We also didn't mention some of the for-profit institutions, and a fair amount of troubled student debt has emanated from.
The way the federal government went after some of those entities.
Yeah.
They came up with equations and ways to try to handicap if their cost was actually worth what income they would make down the road. It seems as though there was a lot more work to put certain schools out of business than looking internally. The government's heavily involved in education. It didn't seem like they shine that flashlight necessarily in their own backyard.
Well, the big involvement, though, is the guarantees that diffuses the incentive to ensure that the students acquiring skills that are going to be worthwhile, and thus they're going to be in a position to be able to repay. I mean, in certain settings, for-profits, are one of them. Although I don't want to tar every for-profit with a brush, but because some are very good. But there are some settings in which you can see that some students are getting, an education that isn't worth it, and are being saddled with debt they can't repay. And it seems plausible that, as in the financial crisis, the willingness of the federal government to guarantee some of those loans is what's diffusing those incentives.
Well, yeah, I think it's just so easy for young people to go out and borrow and pay for ever increasing tuition. And I do think costs have gone up. I don't want to suggest that. And it continues to be a good investment. Nonetheless, you've lost a lot of price discipline, I think, with this freely available debt. And this is the federal government making these loans directly now. I joke, I see some of the things that they do, and we would put a bank in jail, like this negative amortization, it's just like, it's really well-intentioned, but you've got people who are really expert in education trying to be providers of debt and providers of credit, and it's not worked out well. And so I do think this is an area ripe for reform. I hope the president-elect makes this a top priority. I think this would help him a lot with young people where he didn't do very well. It would help him a lot with college graduates where he didn't do very well. And again, I think he can do it in a fiscally responsible way.
Hopefully better than Trump University.
Oh, gosh. All right. Well, I didn't go there.
We can aim in every direction after this political season. Now, I think it's time that this audience interacts with our illustrious panel here. Why don't we start with some questions from the students of Washington College?
There's, Mike,
Why don't you come up to the mic?
come to the mic.
Or- take the mic.
Thank you. Am I on here? Oh, yeah, I'm on. Okay. So how do you think that the national debt would be affected if, say, at the most extreme, President-elect Trump is able to pass all of his immigration policy proposals?
Well, we actually, there's been some good analysis of that by the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya McGinnis heads that. It's very nonpartisan, very good analysis. It suggests that, so back up, the status quo is that the ratio of the federal debt to GDP is 77%. That's the right metric. You want to think about, like your household budget, the ratio of your debt to your ability to repay is the right metric here. That goes up under the baseline to about 86% in 10 years. Under their analysis of the Trump proposals, it goes up to 105%. Now, there's been, so you might wonder, is that big? Is that small? So there's been analysis of a lot of other countries by some economists, most prominently Ken Rogoff, Carmen Reichardt, that suggests that countries get in trouble between 90 and 100% ratio of debt to GDP. There is no magic number. There's no analytical proof that, this number here and all the bells go off. But it's a matter of what happening being that the credibility that investors view your promise just erodes at a certain point. They start to doubt that fiscally, politically, you have the will to actually repay that debt without inflating it away. And that's what usually gets crinkly as that ratio rises. So that's our measure of that's the best analysis I've seen of what would happen under the Trump campaign proposals.
And then, of course, that same number in China would be 200+%, right?
Oh, debt to GDP.
Debt to
Yeah,
GDP in
absolutely.
China. So one of the big issues with China is how much debt is there? Can you believe the numbers? And where are they relative to us? And so I think that's one of the issues I'm
In
sure you...
Japan as well.
Yeah, Japan's very high as
Yep.
well.
But
So,
it's-
I mean, there are exceptions to this, 90 to 100% rule of thumb that they, so you have to take that into account.
And I think, too, on the specific impact of immigration, I think those studies parse some of that out. But I do think that needs to be thought through. We rely heavily on immigrant labor here, and we don't. I think certainly we need immigration reform, but one that needs to recognize that people come to this country to work. I mean, that's why people come to this country. They come to this country for jobs, and they're performing important functions. And I think the previous proposals to have a way to facilitate that labor need through a legalized method as opposed to this very harsh rhetoric that may make people get angry and blame other people for some of our economic problems. But really, if you step back and look at it, it's probably going to hurt the economy if it was really implemented the way that some of the suggestions were during the campaign. So I think you're right to focus on the fact that that's probably going to hurt, not help the economy, hurt, not help working families. And hopefully he'll think that through and work carefully with Congress.
Excellent. Another question?
The microphone is passed.
So it's no surprise that Social Security and other expenditures will not be around by the time I'm 65. What advice can you give to young students now graduating and maybe some people older than us that may or may not have Social Security when they're 65? What recommendations can you give for us to make sure that we have successful retirements as well?
I don't think it's necessarily a foregone conclusion that Social Security will not be there when you're 65. I just hope it's there when I'm 65, more than anything else. I think back to Simpson-Bowles again. There were all sorts of suggestions and proposals within that series of proposals to look at Social Security. Retirement age goes up. Some benefits will be curtailed. There's likely to be means testing at some point. So in Simpson-Bowles, there was a 75-year plan to keep the system glued together if all of those policy proposals were implemented. That would probably get you to 65, 21 plus 75. But I think the devil will be in the details in terms of what happens under the new administration. And Simpson-Bowles was 6-7 years ago, so the numbers have gotten worse.
Gotten worse, yeah.
But by changing some of the assumptions, you can keep the system intact for a reasonable period.
Nothing to add.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
well
ditto.
I guess this question's directed to Mr. Rogers. I was wondering what your opinion on a Roth IRA was, and maybe even funding that over a 401k early on because of the tax benefits of that?
I think the Roth is better than the 401k unless you have some type of a match from your employer going into the 401k, in which case you want to take, I call that an easy win. You want to take the easy wins if you can find them. Either is fine, but if there is any type of match coming into a defined contribution plan by your employer, you want to take advantage of that first. And there's so much mobility now and transferability of account balances that you don't have to worry about losing things in a corporate provided defined contribution plan.
Now we could stick with that row, or we could find some break. Sir?
I'm not a student, but
That's all right. Do we have a microphone to give him?
I think you can hear. You can repeat it.
Nah, we'll give it to you.
Very impressive.
It's down in the pits.
Monty Hall.
He's been there before.
That's impressive.
I'm not a student, but I was a student once. It seems to me to measure any progress, you want to measure toward a goal. And with regard to the federal debt, I've never understood what our goal is. People scream about 20 million, that's too much. People mention the debt as a percentage of GDP, but we ought to have a goal. And I'm just always perplexed that academic institutions and Wall Street and the Fed and all these other people haven't gotten together and say, this is what it should be. Is there anybody thinking about that?
Sure, there's a lot of literature on this. It goes back to actually a paper Paul Samuelson wrote in 1958. Debt's useful. It's a good thing. It's risk-free. Financial markets use treasuries for a lot of good purposes. It's good to have some debt, but like everything, it's good in moderation. So what's the right amount? Well, it ought to be sustainable, which means it shouldn't grow faster than the economy. So the ratio of the amount of debt we have to the economy should be roughly constant over time. Should it be constant at a low level or constant at a high level? Well, there's some economics having to do with that as well. It's sort of complicated. But there is sort of a right amount generally. And what is it? So it depends.
I think, Jeff, have a minute to think about this. I think when you look at the data, debt to GDP as a percent has steadily gone up for the last 50 years, more or less. And so there's never been a right number in the context of that. It's just gotten bigger. And so I think there is a legitimate question. Maybe it's back to your 95 to 100% of GDP is too much.
To some extent, it's a value judgment about the allocation of resources across generations. So, thus, I applaud the way you worded this event as, what does it mean for our students? So for us to issue debt and spend it gives us a bunch of benefits today, but it means less benefits down the road. So it's as if you have all the generations lined up in a row, and they all have a chocolate bar, and you ask them all to hand a chocolate bar this way. And so we get two chocolate bars our generation, and it's like magic, right? But if it grows exponentially, it's not going to work. But it's a matter of a value judgment about our generation versus future generations. potentially.
I think, to your question about, what's the right number, I think it's probably a cyclical number because you want that number to go up in a recession because you do need government stimulus, but in good times, we should be paying it down. And that's the real problem here. During this recovery, the debt just kept going up. And so I worry about what happens, we're going to have another downturn at some point. What's going to happen? So I think, again, where you are in the cycle will also depend what that number is, but presumably you should be slowing it down considerably during a recovery period, which we've not been doing.
Yeah, no, I was a little obtuse and abstract. We're on course to have a generation from now, a generation that's significantly more constrained in the choices they have available to them than we are now, because the debt's going to be higher. There's going to be higher real interest rates, less private investment, greater risks to monetary policy and price stability, greater risks to the stability of financial markets if we let this grow faster than our economy grows. And so do we want to impose those costs on our future generations, or do we want to take measures now to spread the costs out and then incur the cost in small chunks, and we can do it at much less disruption than waiting and having to deal with it in a crisis 10, 20 years from now?
Jeff, let me jump in. This is a conversation I had with almost every student I talked to the last 6, 7, 8 hours, is that there's no way to get to the promised land without belt tightening. And it's very difficult to find anybody that says, okay, who wants to take a little bite tightening, who wants to take a little bit less, so the generation that got the bill for everybody else's dinner the last couple of generations raise their hand. It seems that nobody ever raises their hand. And this is complicated because nobody wants to feel as though they have to make, it seems like the society doesn't want to make sacrifices. I have 3 daughters, about the same age as many students here. We've left them a heck of a situation, all 3 on the panel, and I know every one of you, and I mean this, want to make it easier and better for the future. But it's tough to think that, when we talk about tax policy, raise or lower it, the first thing you read in the newspaper and see on TV, oh, this group's going to be unhappy, this group's going to be happy, and it's always us against them. Just a quick answer, how do we get over that? There needs to be some kind of a kumbaya moment, and I don't see it out there.
Well, I think Martin Feldstein had, I thought, what was a great idea on at least reforming the personal income tax code. Because it's so hard to get into all these different, the mortgage interest deduction, and employer-provided health care, and all the retirement bennies, and child care, everything, charitable. To just put and some of those heavily skewed towards higher income people, and just put an overall cap on okay, we're going to leave all these little Christmas tree items in there, but in aggregate, you can only benefit by X, some percentage point. You can only reduce your tax bill by some percentage point. And I think that does have the benefit politically of helping get this through, and it kind of puts everybody under the same cap, as opposed to saying, okay, we're going to take away mortgages, we're going to leave health care. That is ultimately going to end up into a very difficult and probably doomed
What
political
about means
exercise.
testing? There's a lot of people, I run into people a little bit older
Let's
than
do
me.
it.
Yeah.
Let's means test. Why not?
Yeah, why not?
They say,
Save a lot of
"Listen,
money."
I don't really need my Social Security. I've saved money. Or you hear very wealthy people on TV saying, my secretary pays more taxes than I do. But I don't see that person writing an extra tax check, and I don't see people calling up Social Security saying, forget sending me my check. But means testing would be a good thing, don't we all think?
For entitlements, yeah.
Rick, I think to your point about what would make it happen, we need a crisis to make things happen oftentimes, right? And when
Which is
times are
sad.
relatively good, unemployment's down, right, job creation's good, the economy's kind of muddling along at a reasonable rate, there's no real impetus to change things dramatically right now. And it was no surprise to me that Simpson Bowles, I won't repeat that one more time, came out kind of after the crisis. It was kind of a 2010 thing in response to 2008, 2009. How do we get our fiscal house in order over the next decade? And they were going to cut the debt by $4 trillion, if it all worked. Now,
Bipartisan.
it probably wouldn't have worked quite that way, but that was the plan. But that was born of a crisis, not born of an environment like we're in today, where things are reasonably good and people don't want to make tough decisions.
First of all, Rick, I'd like to congratulate you on being the only voice of reason on CNBC.
I think they would have some debate with that, but I appreciate the sentiment.
But Joe and Becky do a fabulous job. as do you. And you have many good people on there. But the productive capacity of the world was destroyed in 1945. Post that period, the United States was the only place to come. Unfortunately, during that same period, we expanded, because we had high GDP growth concomitantly, we expanded substantially our programs throughout the United States. GDP growth does not appear to look like more than about 2% presently, and I certainly defer to President Lacker to help me remember GDP growth periods, 50s and 60s and 70s. So I'm just curious what the panel's view of GDP growth is going forward, because I think it's relevant to this national debt for youth and opportunities for the youth going forward. So I'm, kind of curious how you all handicap this looking forward.
Sure. I'll start with that. Sure. Yeah. So GDP growth is about 2%. This is our broadest measure of the output of goods and services in our economy. The growth in the labor force is about 0.5%. Employment has been growing faster than that because the unemployment rate's been coming down. But the fact that labor force is growing slowly means GDP growth is going to have to come down a bit. Productivity growth has been low, about 1%. Back in the 60s, I was just looking at these numbers, late 60s, let's say the decade of the 60s, GDP growth was over 4%, 4.5%. Growth in the workforce was about 2%, and productivity growth was 2.5%. So there's these two big differences. The growth in the workforce had to do with population growth, the baby boomers entering the job market. But don't forget also the increase in participation in women. And we've sort of topped out with the gains of the entry of women into the labor force. So we're not going to get that going forward. So on the demographic side, we're just not, that's going to subtract from how well we did in the 60s. We're not going to get back to that. Productivity was exceptionally strong. Productivity growth was exceptionally strong. 2.5 was very strong by historic standards. We've had a surge in the late 90s that was close to that, but we weren't able to sustain that in the last 10, 15 years. So productivity growth is hard to predict, hard to really understand why, hard to really prove the case that this is the cause of slow productivity growth or that's the cause. But, it's plausible that there are the changes in policy configurations that could aid productivity growth. And here I think that the big smoking gun is the fact that capital formation has been lower, is proceeding at a lower rate than before. One of the ways workers become more productive is more capital, more equipment, more software, more stuff that help them make more robots, things to work with. And that's been proceeding at a less rapid pace than in the 60s or the 90s, for example. So that leads you to think about whether there's something in the business environment that's impeding innovation, impeding businesses willing to commit to capital expenditures.
2% going forward?
So for the near term, I think that's the best guess. But I think over time, I'm generally optimistic about us as a country. I think that we have a resilient, flexible economy. I think, policy swings back and forth, but we generally get things pretty right on the whole in the long run. And so I think productivity growth over the next 10, 20 years is likely to pick up to 1.5%, 2% down the road at some point, but I can't foresee when or where or what it's going to be, what it's going to look like.
And John, I think the demographic headwinds are a big deal around the world, not just in the U.S. So certainly in Europe and the U.K., in Japan, interestingly in China, there are a lot of demographic headwinds right now that didn't exist in 10, 20 years ago. I think in terms of the U.S., in terms of demographic headwinds and population growth, I think maybe the students here can have something to do with that changing over the course of the next decade. So it depends on the next generation in terms of U.S. demographic population growth. So the challenge is out there.
Oh, absolutely. You know what time it is?
Touching that one.
It's time for the last question.
Yep.
Let's right here.
Thank you. So 40% of the students nationwide can't afford to continue in some cases, whether they lose a loan that they qualified for the first 2 years in their third year and they can't afford to continue, so they drop and don't have the degree, or say dad is laid off, can't help pay anymore. What sort of policy or solution would you offer to help those students who do not receive the degree because they couldn't afford to continue, or to preemptively strike that problem out?
So I do think the federal government has a role, and I view financing of higher education as an investment in our future. And I think all students should be able to borrow up to a certain common sense amount that will make sense. I think Jeb Bush had a proposal during the campaign. He was going to consolidate all the programs into one loan program with a $50,000 cap, which should get anybody to a 4-year college degree and probably a good part of graduate school as well. And I do think in terms of having changed financial circumstances, again, as I said earlier, getting back into a situation where your repayment obligation, the student, is going to be based on what your actual income will be earned after you graduate, could resolve a lot of those problems. And I also think, so as a matter of federal policy, I hope that's the direction we go. In the short term, I think schools, and we try to do this, have some contingency so that students with changed financial circumstances, their parents having changed financial circumstances, that we can find some extra scholarship funding in those types of situations. So we try to, within our own budget, be responsive to that now, and I think a lot of other colleges do as well, and I hope all of them do. But longer term, I think, again, going to an income share type of financing program will make a lot of sense and reduce a lot of the hardship we're seeing now.
Well, I think we should give a big hand to your president, Sheila Barrett, Brian Rogers, Hero Price, but I think especially this gentleman took the heat, took the questions, gave great answers. Jeffrey Lacker.
Thank you. Great event.
So let me wrap things up here. Thank you all for coming, first of all. And again, thank you, Rick Santelli and Jeff Lachter and Brian Rogers, our very special 3 VIP guests. I think it's a real tribute to Washington College, to our importance, the increasing role we're having on higher education policy and affordability in particular that brought them here. And we really appreciate it so much. And so now they're going to be joining us for a public reception out in the reception hall if you'd like to stick around and enjoy a few hors d'oeuvres and things. And again, thank you very much for coming. Have a good evening.